Good morning, everyone. How are you doing?
Good morning, everybody. Yeah, me toca a mí? Okay, I have to talk in English now. Okay, so I just want to start by saying that my thoughts are with Mexico and Puerto Rico right now. And I feel really bad about how much destruction has taken place, and I hope we can all think of ways to help them. That's all I want to say.
Thank you, Coco. I am sure that everyone's in the room and myself second your feelings, not only for the people that have suffered this tremendous tragedy, but anybody in the world that is suffering. And we're not going to start naming it because, there are lots. I have to say that for me it's an immense pleasure to be here, being one of the last members to join the Creative Time family. So I'm very excited to be here, not only for that because it's extraordinary, but also because I'm here with you. I met Coco Fusco, this fabulous writer, artist, and public intellectual in the late 1990s in Spain when I was a young curator. And we worked together in a project called Els Segadors, which take on the Catalonian national anthem and language as a way of dealing with national identity and cultural identity. And when it's about to become one of the most, I will say, what could be the word? Because it really gets really extremely emotional, but one of the most definitive moments in Spanish democratic history
right
that is currently happening. It seems to me that El Segadors, that was produced in 2001, is one of the most definitive and premonitory works around those issues. So if you haven't had the opportunity, please try to see it.
I was thinking at the time about the way that immigrants to Catalonia were organizing themselves, but also how they were perceived as kind of impossible to integrate into the concept of the Catalan homeland. And so we used the national anthem as a sort of poetic space in which to explore that disjuncture between the immigrants and this Catalan nationalism. And I'm fairly sure now that if the Catalans succeed in seceding, that the first thing that they're going to do is expel the immigrants from their land.
But that is in the future. We don't know exactly what is going to happen.
It's Sunday.
But what is clear is that I think there is a current negotiation that is going to be, as I was saying, definitive for the future of democracy in Spain. But we want to talk today to you guys about patria and the definition of in his definition of as fatherland.
Homeland in Spanish translates as patria, so it's a very masculine, patriarchal term. And my experience as a member of a diaspora with no right to return to Cuba is of that concept of homeland as being the property of the state, not of the people of Cuba. And a lot of the work that I've done, both as an artist and also as a researcher and a writer, has been about this conflict between the state's ownership of revolution and homeland and the people's understanding of what constitutes a people and a country.
So in order to illustrate what we're going to be discussing in the next 20 minutes, we thought that we will bring to you a work of a young artist, one of the most brilliant in his generation, Hamlet Labastida, whose work Coco also talks about in Dangerous Move, her book on politics and performance in Cuba. A work called Reflection from 2009 that will help, as I said, to illustrate this next 20 minutes of conversation.
Yeah, I just, as a prelude, I forgot to say this at the beginning, but we were talking about this before we got on stage, is that I feel like the discourses up to now have been very utopian in the notion of homeland, and that here we are to kind of bring the dystopian dimension of this concept. But Hamlet works in Cuba, and much of his work has been about deconstructing the iconography and the rhetoric of patria, which is why I chose to show a short animation piece of his.
And we had to say it's mainly in Spanish, but we thought that in any case was illustrative enough to bring some of the ideas that then we will reflect upon. So bear with us and enjoy the piece.
Nuestra fábrica en aquella etapa tenía que realizar toda una serie de actividades, jornadas guerrilleras, maratones de 24 horas, jornadas diarias de 12 horas, trabajando 12, 14 horas y durmiendo aquí mismo en la fábrica. Eso no quiere decir que en aquella etapa, pues la fábrica aumentó su productividad.
Chicos, eso está muy malo. La verdad es que uno va a comer ahí porque no es de aquí y va a almorzar ahí porque no es de aquí y tiene que ir ahí. Ya no hay, esta tarde mismo no se pudo.
Yo digo, superarlo sí, tener más recursos sí, ¿por qué no? Pero como una revolución socialista reparte los recursos, cuando nosotros tenemos más producción, ¿cómo repartimos los recursos?
Un dirigente tiene que ser revolucionario. No le basta con ser buena gente y consolar a todo el mundo. Eso es lo que yo creo que debe ser un dirigente sindical.
Higiénicamente aquello está destrozado. Allí hemos tenido días que lo saben los obreros, si son honestos y quieren decir verdad, hemos comido hasta menudos de reses descompuestos. Esto yo, vaya, lo he reservado, ya que llegue este momento vamos a hablarlo, porque aquí tenemos que buscar que esto se mejore, pase lo que pase y sucede lo que sucede. ¿Oíste? Hemos comido bacalao descompuesto hasta 3 días seguidos ahí. Yo prefiero que se cierre a que sigan las condiciones que están. Y yo creo que todos los obreros que estén conscientes y sean honestos y sean revolucionarios, lo piensan igual que yo, que si no pueden mejorar, es preferible que se cierre.
Él es un hombre que es un majadero, no le gusta que los hijos estén en la calle. Sobre todo, el mes pasado salió de aquí a las 10 de la mañana y eran las 1 y no había venido y le dio golpe porque a él no le gusta. Un hombre de mucho carácter, tiene mucha rectitud sobre su hijo, sobre sus hijos y figúrese, una majadería imposible.
Extraordinary word, don't you think? I wanted to use this, one of the quotes that is, and let's use this moment to unpack some of the elements of the piece that perhaps for somebody that doesn't speak Spanish are hard to get. Can you tell us a little bit of the context in which these artists operate, and then we start unpacking the concept in patria o muerte?
Well, he made this as a almost graduate part of his graduate work at the University of the Arts, but he's made several other animations. And almost all of Hamlet's work is about is deconstructing the official rhetoric of the party and speeches, and he's very interested in kind of excavating our history, going into archive, which is not easy to do in Cuba because the state owns all its documents and doesn't make them all available to people. But he's been able to access a lot of materials both inside and outside the country. He's spent quite a bit of time in Poland and Spain as well as in Cuba, and has sometimes accessed from outside to play with the insignias and the symbols and the rhetoric and sometimes even the speeches. When he works in Cuba, he often does wall murals in which he revives famous speeches from the darkest moments of the early years of the revolution, so referring to the labor camps where homosexuals and the religious were interned for several years, or to decrees against intellectuals and so on and so forth, and he'll revive them, or sometimes he'll use rhetoric that is supposed to be very triumphalist or very utopian or very positive, and kind of put it out there as a measure against which you see sort of the decline, right? And so you look at the words and you look at the reality around the words, and you're supposed to understand the gap between the two.
So, and it's very interesting that many aspects of what we are reading in the screen, for instance, like there is a moment where he says el oscuro universo de la cubanidad, no? The darkest, I would say, universe of the Cubanness, no? Or who is speaking, quien habla, right? And I think it connects very well with your, with what I hope we can discuss a little bit further and elaborate on the idea of how the priority of the state is imposed over individual desires in the name of this fatherland. No? And I want to use fatherland somehow to defend the idea that motherland is something more utopic and unreachable, and what we are all hoping to reach. No?
Right. But the space of motherland in Cuba is really the home. It's not the street, right? The public space belongs to the state, and the state is the owner of patria.
Yes, so that's why I wanted to emphasize that character of fatherland, and patria civitas, as Curator will say, patria communis, as the fatherland. No? So in that context, can you please elaborate a little bit on this idea of patria o muerte in relation to that prioritization of the state?
It was a way for the current political order to capitalize on a history of struggle for independence in Cuba when it was a Spanish colony. And so there was, in the 19th century, people talking about freeing the fatherland, right? And that becomes, in the 1960s, free fatherland or death is basically the rallying cry against the supposed foreign invader, right, the United States. There's no fatherland or death against the Soviet Union or Venezuela or China, which are the other countries that have maintained the island, only against the United States. So, but the concept, which is in a sense a political fiction, it's not so much tied to a concept of the earth as it is to this idea of the party and the fatherland being tied to the state. That is an extremely powerful coercive fiction, because basically the call has been for Cubans to sacrifice their lives to maintain the fiction. And that could be, that justifies the total militarization of the country. It justifies sending Cubans off to wars in foreign lands. And it also, in the 1960s and 70s, became the rationalization for the state's appropriation of everyone's time for volunteer work. So there was an economic need for this, because in actuality, as from the mid-1960s onwards, the Cuban economy was declining and productivity was actually going down. And so there was a kind of economic need to increase productivity, but the ideological mechanism by which to increase productivity was to develop this moral argument about self-sacrifice. And that has over and over again, the call has been for give up, but it also has been giving up rights. And this is something that begins around the time of the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, in the same way that in the United States, after the attack of 9/11, we were told that we had to give up our rights and allow for a Patriot Act to sweep into our private lives. Well, this begins in Cuba in the early 60s and continues, and has become the rationalization for the control of information, for the monopoly on press, for the denigration and criminalization of independent media in Cuba, for the total control of cultural property, and so on and so forth. So that, there is a connect. It's not just the party, the state, and the fatherland, but it's the party, the state, the fatherland, and in the realm of culture, cultural patrimony, that the state decides what constitutes the patrimony of the country, and that is not equal to the sum total of cultural production by Cubans inside or outside the island.
I want to go back to patrimony in a second, but before that, I thought to bring a quote of the Dangerous Move, because it has to do with what you were saying now about the militarization of every aspect of daily life. And I want us to talk a little bit more about the role of the artist within that process. No? And there is a moment in the book where you talk about social and political conduct in Cuba are shaped by surveillance, right? Because policing there is not limited to the control of what will be usually defined as criminal act, again, person, property, or the state. Cuban surveillance is also designed to fare outside ideological nonconformity, and artists have always been on its radar because of the history of distrust of their endeavor. Stemming in part, as you said, from an orthodox Marxism view of immaterial labor of non-productive. And of course, you're talking about moments which this perspective of the 60s and 70s was prevail, let's say, but also and how it reverberates in the moment that we live now. No? And that's how artists like La Bastida and many others recuperated. So what is the role of the artist, how he or she, or as collective, they can sort of like skip that without, or do they need to fulfill certain patriotic duties? Can they skip that, and which are the strategies they're using in order to create a counterculture that is also sustainable?
Well, this is a very unusual moment in the history of the Cuban Revolution, because on the one hand, the mechanisms of the state are still there, the forces of repression and also the enabling forces of the state, because the state is not just a repressor. No one would accept that. It's also an enabler. They run the schools, they run the art school, they run the museums, they even buy art from living artists from time to time. So, the state has that dual function. But unlike Cuba up to the early 1990s, we now have a Cuba that has internet in a limited way, but some access. A number of, many more Cubans have cell phones than had landlines at this point, and that allows a different, more ongoing contact with outside. We also have the elimination since 2013 of required exit visas for Cubans to travel, which has enabled members of the elite to move around the world at a much greater rate than before. So there's more porousness, and there's also, all sorts of homemade piracy and subversion of the total control of culture by the state, whether it's people putting antennas up on their roofs and getting television from Miami, or the famous El Paquete that people in the tech world are so obsessed with. It's basically just pirated media on hard drives that circulates for about $2.50 per load into your hard drive. So there's this new porousness, and has contributed to the rapid decline of watching Cuban television, much to the chagrin of the state, and lots of speeches by the Minister in Culture about the decline of the Cuban mind as a result of all of this media coming in from outside. So that's the panorama of the present, which is different from the way things were once upon a time. That said, your question about do Cubans still artists have to still toe the line vis-a-vis the state? Well, if they want the state to support them, they do. And that way of towing the line can take many forms. I mean, there are Cuban artists like Cacho who have been members of parliament, even, and Silvio Rodriguez. There are others who are called upon to spy on their friends. There are others who are called upon to write letters denouncing their associates. There are others who are asked to assume bureaucratic positions, and then they have to become part of a repressive apparatus themselves. So there are a number of ways in which one's political allegiance is solicited in order to guarantee what at this point? Because once upon a time, 30 or 35 years ago, that would have been the requirement to be a student at the art school, for example, or to be entitled to travel. And the state at that point could anoint you and say, you are a politically safe person to allow to leave the country. We know that you'll come back and you won't shame us. At this point, it's basically the state still operates as the principal marketing arm of Cuban culture. So if you're out of favor with the state, they're not going to bring any collectors or curators to meet you when they come to town, and they're not going to, you're not going to be selected for residencies and other opportunities that are made available through state channels. One way that some artists have subverted this is to organize contacts independently outside, or to use Facebook and other forms of social media to create digital galleries of their work and get this out. This has been the main way that a lot of independent musicians have been operating since they've acquired more internet access. And a kind of a project that I have been involved with for a very long time, Aglutinador, which is the oldest and longest running independent art gallery in Cuba, run by the artist Sandra Ceballos, has basically, she sustained her project for 24 years with a little bit of grant money coming from outside from time to time.
So let's go to, for instance, Espacio Aglutinador that you just mentioned, and as one of these strategies that artists and curators are using to create a narrative that is a counter-cultural narrative of the art history, or the history, say, of Cuban through art, right? And on the other hand, going back to patrimonio, right? What it continues to be the way in which the state want to celebrate what Cuban art means, and how that referred to a larger and more concentrated image of the state, image of the fatherland.
Right. Well, I mean, the project of Aglutinador started very small in 1994. This was during the early years of the special period, at the end of a wave of several years of intense censorship in the arts milieu that forced into exile almost an entire generation of artists. And Sandra was one of the only members of that 80s generation who stayed, and she was supposed to have an exhibition with her then partner at a state gallery, and it was shut down, and they decided to bring the show back to the apartment and have the show in the apartment. And it was so welcomed, this idea of kind of taking the art back and having the artists assume control over presentation, that she decided to continue. And the name Aglutinador, the word means to agglutinate, is to bring together, to sort of bring together all the different elements. And the kind of curatorial principle of the space, has been to bring Cuban art together regardless of where you live, what your politics are, or what your standing is vis-a-vis the Cuban government. So they have done exhibitions of artists who have been imprisoned, artists who have been censored, artists who were forgotten, artists who fell out of favor, artists who went into exile, artists who made work that wasn't the political fashion, together with projects of young artists graduating from art school who have ideas that are not going to fly in a state entity, and they want to do them anyway, and so they go to Aglutinador to do them. And that's been the principle throughout. Now, in recent years, I would say maybe in the last 5 years or so, the state entities in culture have been trying to figure out how to deal with the 80s generation specifically, so many of whom are living outside the country, because it creates a sort of hole if you're trying to present a canon, let's say at the National Museum of Fine Arts or wherever, that you can't exhibit people who are in exile, and then you lose your entire 80s collection. You can't put it out there, right? And so Galeria Habana has been assigned the task of recuperating a number of artists who are living outside, but who are acceptable to return, and showing them as well. So now the state is following what Sandra has been doing for 24 years.
So with that note, the counterculture helping to shape anew the history of a place like Cuba.
And that's what we want to continue. I mean, I'm working with Sandra right now on a big, campaign to repair the space, to upgrade the technology, to be more in communication with the outside world, and to create workshops so that the critics and art historians who have worked with her can teach people about all these artists who are not part of the official canon. Zero.
Boom.
Thank
you so much.